Fine. I'm Keith, and next to me is Nancy, and this is the story of Nancy's Nunes Carvalho ancestry. And thank you, Tom, thank you, David, for the chance to share our story with you. When we started this research, we had no idea that the story would take us back to 1550 in Portugal. It would continue via Amsterdam, London, down to Barbados and the Caribbean, Charleston, and then on up the US East Coast to New York. Versions of this story, this talk, were given to the Southern Jewish History Society in Austin, Texas, the Society of Jewish Librarians in Charleston, the Barbados Carolinas Genealogy Conference in Bridgetown, and the Jewish Genealogical Society in London. So, if I can introduce Nancy, she is a documented 13th generation Carvalho, descended from a Sephardic Jewish family who escaped from the Portuguese Inquisition. That's 500 years in just 40 minutes. So please fasten your seatbelts. Here is the family. I'll break the story into three parts. The European part, the Barbados Charleston part, that's from 1800 to 1845. And finally through to the Carvalhos in America.
One moment, Keith. I'm still looking at the first slide. Yeah.
My screen sharing is paused. I don't know why that is.
Maybe you can click to the left on the slide.
No, it's gone. Well, shall I go back?
Yeah.
What can you see?
I see the first slide, the Nunes Carvalho.
Can you see the 13 generation slide?
Yes, that's the third one.
Okay.
But it's very small to the left.
I'm not sure what you mean. I've got full screen.
Then it's not sharing.
Shall I start again?
Yes.
Okay.
But only close the PowerPoint and start the PowerPoint.
Okay. Sure.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm asking for your patience for a few minutes. Well, Keith is starting his PowerPoint again. Thank you. Yes, slideshow. Click on it, yeah. It's still...
I'm afraid it's still not going. Try again.
What could be the case, David?
I am afraid I don't know. I'm just looking to see if he sent us a copy.
Well, if I just carry on talking. Sorry, guys. I don't know what it is.
Tom, do you have a copy of the platform?
No, not a good one. But it's working now for me because if Keith clicks on the slides...
I'm clicking down. Instead of using slideshow, I'm just clicking on these slides.
Yes, that works for me.
I'll try and full screen.
For you, David, as well?
Yes, that works.
Okay.
Well, I'm sorry, everybody, but can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay. Right, so what I was saying was this is three parts: Europe, Barbados, Charleston, and USA. Maybe as this is largely a Jewish genealogical audience, if I can firstly highlight the facilities we particularly valued for our Sephardic research. The London Metropolitan Archive, which includes all the Bevis Marks records and the minute books of the Bridgetown Barbados Synagogue. The Stats Archive in Amsterdam for its UNESCO Heritage Awarded collections of the early Portuguese Jewish community. Here our essential guide was the incomparable Tom Thielen, who was very much our mentor for the Dutch part of our story. The Portuguese State Archive in Lisbon, Torre do Tomba, for its vast collection of Inquisition documents. In Charleston, we had enormous help and encouragement from Dale Rosengarten, head of special collections at the College of Charleston Library. For online ancestry trees, we found MyHeritage best for Jewish and American results, but we were early adopters and we found many people hijacked our research, and that's fair enough, that's how the internet works, but it is very irritating to be chased by MyHeritage to confirm that we agree with hundreds of matches of material, which was actually taken from our own research. And so to our Carvalho project. Until we started, Nancy had not really appreciated that she was a quarter Jewish. She did not know that her grandmother, Adele Carvalho's husband, Dr. Ernest French, who had been a respected Harley Street physician, I've got him here, there we are, here, down the bottom, Major Ernest French, doctor, physician. He'd been born in Jamaica, illegitimate and coloured, and he was the son of a lodging house keeper in Kingston. In 1907, he travelled to New York with an introduction to the prominent Carvalho family there, and he soon married eldest daughter Adele. Their son, Nancy's late father, Jeffrey, was also a doctor, but he had never discussed his Jewish and Jamaican origins with her. So you can imagine our surprise when Nancy took a DNA test and it showed not only a 27% Jewish origin, but also 6% African, Mandenka and Yoruba tribes of West Africa, clearly indicating her grandfather's Jamaica slave ancestry. I guess our parents' generation found it hard to admit to such things, but our own kids, of course, are enthralled by their exotic background. Grandmother Adele's father was David Carvalho. He was a famous, infamous New York handwriting expert, and he provided evidence to the Dreyfus trial in Paris in 1900. His father was Solomon Nunes Carvalho. He was an early daguerreotypist or photographer, and he'd crossed the Rockies on horseback in the winter of 1853-54 with Colonel John Fremont, mapping a possible railroad route to California, the Union's latest state. Solomon's father, David Nunes Carvalho, had been an early instigator of the Reformed Israelite movement in Charleston, Carolina. David and his elder brother, Emmanuel, had originally crossed from London to Barbados, where they lived in the early 1800s, attached to Nida Israel Synagogue, before moving to Beth Elohim in Charleston. The Carvalho family had lived in London for most of the 1700s as jewelers and working in semi-precious stones. And they'd emigrated there from Amsterdam, where Abraham had been a shipping broker, trading in particular with Oporto, Portugal, from where he'd fled the Inquisition in 1689. In Portugal, Abraham had been baptized as Catholic Manuel on the 24th of March, 1650. Portuguese Jews baptized their children into Catholicism as soon as they could in order to conceal their background. They became new Christians or conversos. Some, of course, genuinely converted. Others became crypto-Jews, secretly practicing for generations. Yes. The Carvalhos lived in Trancoso. That's a walled inland village near the border with Spain. There is now a small museum there, the Isaac Cardoso Center, and it has an entire wall covering the Nunes Carvalho story. When we visited Trancoso, the mayor greeted us, and together we placed a wreath at the cemetery where Miguel, a sibling of Manuel, was buried. We think the Carvalho family probably originally came from Salamanca, a lovely old university town just over the border with Spain. So you can see there's Salamanca, there's Trancoso, there's Porto. Manuel's Portuguese father was Francisco, nicknamed Coca. He was a merchant. He had 11 children, most of whom became targets for the Inquisition for being secret or crypto Jews. 2 died young, at least one, Joa, I don't know how you pronounce that, John, was actually burnt at the stake for heresy. We have extensive records of what happened to the other family members from the transcripts of the Inquisition trials of Coimbra. The Portuguese Inquisition had commenced in 1536 and continued until 1821. It was overwhelmingly preoccupied with the eradication of Judaic beliefs and practices among the new Christians. In the Coimbra tribunal, these represented 83% of all trials from 1566 to 1762. Sephardic Jews, if they repented, had all their goods confiscated, and they were then sent to Catholic priests for relearning the true faith. Over time, many fled to more tolerant places like Amsterdam, London, and the Caribbean, mostly as merchants. But they often had family remaining in Portugal, with whom they did business. So in order to avoid endangering relatives and friends there, they used aliases in their transactions. And this makes genealogical research difficult, to say the least. The Inquisition was a terrifying organization, answerable only to the Pope and the King. Being found guilty of, quote, heresy, apostasy, and Judaism could mean being burnt at the stake. Faced with this, Manuel, aged just 13, like many others, guilty or not, voluntarily confessed the error of his ways and repented. We had the 230-page handwritten document of his trial process from the Torre de Tombo translated. It was expensive and it took months. There are over 40,000 individual trial transcripts in Lisbon, largely untranscribed and untranslated, a treasure trove for Sephardic family historians. On a good day, they look like this. You can imagine how hard it is to transcribe the Portuguese handwriting of nearly 500 years ago. A terrified 13-year-old Manuel, having confessed to all the charges, was led into the public square in Coimbra in front of thousands to hear his fate at the auto da fe, or act of faith. As he had voluntarily confessed, he was merely reconciled and all his meager possessions confiscated by the church. He is then excommunicated and then instructed in prison in the Catholic faith so as to return to the true church. Better than the alternative. There's a picture of an auto da fe. You can see there are bonfires there are victims, there are crowds, there are crucifixes. Clearer images are available, but many are very gruesome. For the next few years, Manuel kept a low profile. He became a successful merchant, a shipping broker. He traded tobacco, sugar, spices, and semi-precious stones, and he had boats based in Porto. And in 1678, aged 27, he married Leonor Rodriguez in Porto. This is a Porto today, a lovely town on the Douro River, well worth a visit. When we visited, we found the little back street where the Carvalhos lived, just off the main square facing the waterfront. Soon they had 4 children, all baptized with Catholic names. In 1689, the reinvigorated Portuguese Inquisition attacked Manuel again, accusing him of relapse into heresy. Claiming he needed to go abroad to raise finance to pay off his creditors, he escaped on a ship to Amsterdam. Pretty simple when he lived just 100 meters from the waterfront and his boats. He sailed via Bayonne. This may be the Spanish port of that name, or possibly Bayonne in France. He left his wife Leonore and his 4 children behind, and they were apart for 2 years. We'd hoped to find the usual birth, marriage, deaths references in the Amsterdam city archives, but we were blown away with what we actually discovered. We spent a day there with the ever helpful Tom. He found for us the probate papers for Manuel's wife, Leonore's bachelor brother, Abraham Rafael Rodriguez. A wealthy merchant, he had left his estate to 3 beneficiaries, including his sister, Leonore. And the file was full of poignant letters from Leonore to her husband when she was left alone in Porto and he was in Amsterdam. When finally transcribed and translated, no mean feat, they read, quote, "I ask God to remove me from this purgatory so that we may see each other again. Twice the inquisitors have visited me. I have not had an answer from my many writings. I have been in the prison dungeon now for 5 months. The children are well." That's the letter from Leonore, or one of them. Although we might struggle to read this now, in 1690, for a woman, this will be considered quite an educated hand. In the city archive in Amsterdam, we found a dozen or so of these moving personal letters. What a treasure trove. There were also commercial documents which disclose the aliases used by the family in their business dealings with Portugal. These unlocked the family connections. Through them, we established that Abraham Carvalho in Amsterdam was in fact Manuel in Porto. It was a big breakthrough. Finally, Leonore and her children escaped Porto and joined Abraham in Amsterdam, where she became Sarah, and the 4 children each took Hebrew names. Francisco became Isaac, Geronimo Raphael, Beatrix Esther, and Katerina became Rachel. Frustrated by being thwarted by Manuel's absence in Holland, the prosecutors for the Inquisition held a second trial for him in his absence. But as he was out of reach abroad, they had an effigy of him burnt at the stake. His brother John had already been burnt alive. In Holland, Jews enjoyed religious freedom and as international traders contributed significantly to Amsterdam's booming economy. It was a golden age. By 1675, the city had a magnificent synagogue, still magnificent today. Many Jews lived nearby on Judenbraestraat, Jews' Broad Street. Abraham's neighbors were the Montaltos at number 1, Rodriguez at number 3, the Da Costas and the Pintos at 7 and 9, and a little later, just round the corner at number 4, the Rembrandts. So let's just recap where we have got to with the family. In 1705, Abraham and Sarah's eldest son, Isaac, married in Amsterdam Judith Lopez. She was a Sephardic girl. She'd escaped from Madrid. An orphan, she'd won a lottery from the community dowry, the dotar, but payable only if she found a husband. Fortunately, she found Isaac, and he collected the cash. Meanwhile, in London, the community had built the splendid new synagogue of Bevis Marks. And in 1708, Isaac and Judith, along with many others, emigrated there, Isaac becoming a jeweler in the city of London. From Judith's will of 1735, written in Portuguese, it seems they were quite well off, and the Carvalho family remained in London for nearly a century, continuing to work in semi-precious stones and attending Bevis Marks. Isaac's son Samuel had a son, the first Solomon Carvalho. American historian, Bertram Korn wrote, quote, Solomon despite his modest circumstances, instilled in his children a love of learning and refinement, which went beyond the simple education received in the Congregational School of Bevis Marks. Two of his, Solomon's sons, Emmanuel and David, demonstrated both in their vocations and associations that they took their father's aspirations well to heart. Emmanuel Carvalho, while a young man working in his father's East End jewellery business, had studied Hebrew and other languages at Bevis Marks. Age 21, he married Sarah Morera, a rabbi's daughter, in 1790. And that's the European part of the story. And now we continue to Barbados. Bevis Marks had a close connection with the Nida Israel synagogue in Bridgetown. And when in 1799 that synagogue needed a new Hazan or reader, they suggested Emmanuel. So off he went. En route, he was shipwrecked, losing everything he had in the ship C.A. Goodwin. Because of his distressed condition on arrival, the Bridgetown elders gave him £60 from the Tzedakah, or charity, to buy linen, furniture, and other necessities. His salary of £80 in currency, that's a year, would start at Passover, and a silk gown was purchased for him to officiate. Soon, Emmanuel was complaining at his salary, requesting an increase to £200 per annum. This was refused as being improper, but eventually they did grant him a backdated increase to £130. He was an argumentative man, and the minutes tell of many issues with the elders, especially about his inadequate salary. Here is an example. These minutes, which are now in the London Metropolitan Archives, are 200 years old. It took me weeks to photograph them and then to transcribe them. Interestingly, in 1803, Emmanuel, a Jew, was a Freemason, a member of Lodge 308. Barbados was not a healthy place then, with malaria and yellow fever endemic. In 1803, Emmanuel took 6 months off the island to take his sick wife, Sarah, to London to recover her health. The elders granted him £100 for the voyage. To help with the services in his absence, he invited his younger brother, David, who was just 17, from London to Bridgetown. But teenager David could not cope with the discipline, and a hearing of the elders was called to consider his gross misconduct. He'd appeared in a state of inebriation, so as to be incapable of performing his duty before prayers were concluded. So he said he wanted to go home, and his resignation was accepted immediately. But still in Bridgetown 2 months later, he asked for assistance with his passage home, but this was rejected, so he remained there until his brother Emmanuel returned. When he did, Emmanuel requested, as an addition to the house he occupied, the communal bathhouse, the mikveh. In return, his wife would keep it clean, free of any emolument. He was given the key conditionally, not to allow any improper person to use it, or for men to lodge there before 9 p.m. Restored, it is still there today. Complaints about the way Emmanuel held services continued. Also that he kept a cow, which he suffered to dung the synagogue and let it graze in the burial ground. So they decided to discharge him and wrote to Bevis Marks requesting a replacement. They wrote, "Gentlemen, emblematic of the decayed and almost annihilated congregation of Jews in this island, the person we require is one that could be content to live well as a poor man in the West Indies, where he will enjoy a house rent-free and a salary of £130 per annum, on which he will be enabled to subsist comfortably, particularly if a single man, though on some accounts a married man would be preferred. He must read Hebrew correctly and attentively, understanding what he reads. Singing can be dispensed with for those with more consequential qualifications. He must also be a kosher butcher. I authorize you to pay his passage and what is absolutely necessary for his coming out, praying that the interviews be very short and that every exertion be used to expedite his arrival here to fill the vacancy. Mr. Carvalho, despite all our generosities to him and his discharge being entirely of his own seeking, refuses to continue services of God till we can be supplied with his replacement. Eventually bankrupt Emmanuel departed Bridgetown in 1808, went to Charleston for a short time, and then to Cherith, Israel in New York. There he taught Hebrew and other languages. In the minutes dated 1809, he asked, as his health had become impaired in New York, to be relieved from his contract as teacher, or to have his salary increased from $800 to $1,300 per annum. The New York trustees declined his request, expecting him to do his duty. Surprisingly, at least to us in 2020, the 1810 census shows 3 resident slaves in Emmanuel's New York household, presumably domestic staff, perhaps brought with them from Barbados. When in 1811, Beth Elohim in Charleston offered Emmanuel the post of Hazan, he took it. He said the warm climate would suit him better, the best post on the continent. A map from the Library of Charleston shows that the Carvalho residence was just a few hundred yards from the Beth Elohim Synagogue, which was itself close to the main traders' streets of King and Meeting Streets in Charleston. Emmanuel and David lived at 29 Hazel Street. This is the somewhat refurbished property now. Charleston is a lovely city to visit. In Charleston, Emmanuel was not only Hazan, but established a school where he taught Hebrew and Spanish. But again, he got into trouble with the religious authorities, mainly about his liberal tendencies. Quote, Emmanuel taught the children to sing the concluding psalm of the Sabbath morning service in a very handsome manner, and did away with the discordance which attends every synagogue. But the adjunta said he was disrespectful to them, and they suspended him. He then, quote, collected a rabble composed of all the vagrant Jews in the city and had a petition signed to give him redress. An actual riot resulted in the synagogue, quote, with clubs, bruising, boxing. His brother and friend, quote, came off with a few thumps. The result was completely destroyed the small remnant of respectability and character yet left for Mr. Carvalho. His liberal tendencies, however, did not extend to Charleston's enslaved population. In 1814, he purchased, quote, for $250, a certain Negro boy named Sandy. Sober, honest, and no runaway, a rabbi buying slaves. No problem in Charleston, not then. Shortly after, sick and quarrelsome, he resigned his post to become the Hazan of Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, where he published a Hebrew grammar and a dictionary, dying there childless in 1817, buried in the Spruce Street Cemetery there. Emmanuel's younger brother David, Nancy's direct ancestor, had emigrated to Barbados in 1803 and remained without Emmanuel, going with him to New York City and then to Charleston. This is the earliest image of any Nunes Carvalho we've ever found. It may be someone watching this knows of others, or welcome. In 1812, the USA was at war with Great Britain, and David was classified by South Carolina Marshal's Return of Enemy Aliens as single, 25 years old, lapidary, enemy alien, no intention to naturalize. Nevertheless, later that year, he was with the volunteers in the Charleston Merchant Service Militia, defending the city against the British, of which, of course, he was still one. In Charleston, David, age 29, met and married Sarah Cohen d'Azevedo, daughter of a visiting Hazan from Bevis Marks. In 1815, their first son, Solomon, was born. David was a leading member of the Reformed Society of Israelites, proponents of a more liberal, less orthodox community. They met in Sales Masonic Hall on Meeting Street. David was the unpaid Hazan. David also attracted enemies. The Carvalhos were a hot-tempered lot. And in 1818, David was assaulted, insulted, and abused by Nathan Hart in the synagogue, and a court case followed. David became a US citizen in 1820. In the city directories of that time, David is shown as resident in King Street, Charleston, as a jeweler and watchmaker. Street numbers have changed many times in Charleston, and there was also a major fire in 1838, destroying a large part of the town. So it's difficult to identify his address now, but the present 123 to 125 are likely. In the 1820 census, this shows him, David, and his wife in Charleston with 3 children under 10 and 2 female slaves, presumably domestics, living in King Street as a jeweler and a watchmaker. He participated in the publication of a new prayer book and hymnal, and as a young father of daughters, he particularly wanted to give the same recognition to daughters as sons received at circumcision. So he devised a charming naming ceremony for girls. Although David had been heavily involved in the bitterly resisted reform movement, he ultimately gave up the struggle. And in 1828, he left Charleston. By then, he and Sarah had had 8 children. Their eldest son, Solomon, worked throughout the Caribbean. In his obituary, he is described as being in Barbados, working for his mother, Sarah's brother, Dazaveda. He was a merchant and had a number of trading vessels. Solomon traveled considerably for the firm and gained much information which was of value to him later in life. A few years later, he started to return to America, but the vessel was shipwrecked off the coast of Delaware. Through swimming ashore, the lives of his passengers and crew were saved. All were cast ashore without money. But it was here his knowledge of art came in good stead, and by drawing crayon portraits of people in the village where he was cast away, he raised enough money to return to his home. In 1838, aged just 23, he was in Charleston, a professional artist. The Beth Elohim synagogue burned down that year, so he painted it from memory. The congregation paid him $50 for it, the maximum they were prepared to pay for one object. It now hangs in the synagogue museum. He was also running a dry goods store in Charleston. Despite their obvious creative and intellectual talents, the Carvalhos never shirked hard graft in making their living. There's a Carvalho and Hirsch advertisement for a positive sale of clothing and dry goods at the northeast corner of Society in King Street. That's in 1841. In 1840, Solomon painted a child with rabbits picture, subsequently used on many US and Canadian banknotes. In 1841, the family moved back from Charleston to Barbados. David is a watchmaker and still manufacturing paper, and his son Solomon, now 26, painting portraits and miniatures. There was a small Jewish community in Bridgetown, mainly centered on Swan Street, even then known as Jew Street. It was then, and still is now, a trader's street, selling everything Bridgetonians required. Solomon developed a reputation for painting portraits and miniatures, and his younger sisters started a millinery business. These images can be found in the Barbados Museum Library. Here's an extract from the Barbados Globe in 1842. Solomon Nunes Carvalho presents to the Ladies' Association, for the relief of the indigent sick, his portrait of Mrs. Humpleby, the founder of the institution. An American artist, Mr. Carvalho, whose studio was at 6 Swan Street, presented the association with a portrait of their beloved and affectionately revered foundress, Mrs. Humpleby. The gift was greatly appreciated. And from the Journal of the Barbados Museum Historical Society, this artist appears to have painted miniatures. In an advertisement, he informs those waiting for miniature cases and frames that he's received supplies from London. And in 1842, the Mrs. Carvalho, that's David Carvalho's daughters, recently arrived from Philadelphia, will conduct a mantua making and a millinery business at the corner of Victoria Street and Bolton Lane, number 10. But just 1 month later, on the 16th of November, 1842, tragedy struck. On Sunday morning at the residence of her brother, Mr. Solomon Nunes Carvalho, Miss Sarah Carvalho, aged 19 years and 2 months, daughter of David Carvalho and Sarah d'Azevedo, formerly of Charleston, recently arrived from America, died of yellow fever after 3 days' illness, and was buried yesterday in the synagogue burial ground. And 8 weeks later, on the 11th of January, 1843, died on Saturday evening of yellow fever at the residence of his father, David Carvalho, in Bolton Lane, aged 15 years, 3 months, Benjamin. They were buried together in the Jewish cemetery. The headstone is still there. In 1843, Solomon was subscribing to the Bridgetown Occident, which is a journal sponsored by his friend Isaac Leeser. And in 1844, his father was listed as a merchant in the marble paper manufacturing business and very active in the Bridgetown congregation. But perhaps the double tragedy of the two children was the reason why, soon after, the reduced Carvalho family left Barbados on the ship Turk's Island for Philadelphia. The restoration of the synagogue area of downtown Bridgeton is simply stunning, and it's a credit to all involved. It just shows what $10 million can do. In 1844, in Philadelphia, Solomon, then aged 30, met and fell for the lovely 20-year-old Sarah Miriam Solis. Her father had died, so Solomon wrote to her brother, seeking his approval to the marriage. I'll read just a few bits of it. For your esteemed sister Sarah, I have conceived other than mere commonplace feelings. Her amiability, sweetness of temper, congeniality of disposition, and, I dare hope, a reciprocity of sentiment, have awakened in my bosom feelings of a deep and ardent affection. To my family connections, you can make no reasonable objections. My pecuniary means are sufficiently ample. If I should be so fortunate to receive your sanction, I would cherish for your sister those feelings I should wish a husband to have for my own sisters. That's not quite how my daughter's boyfriends put it when they asked me for their hands in marriage, but at least they didn't send me a tweet. 3 months later, they were married and went on honeymoon to the West Indies, where they were shipwrecked. They're a stunning young couple. This is Solomon. And just look at this picture he painted of his lovely wife, Sarah. This original is now in the Yeshiva Museum in New York City. I photoed Nancy in front of it. A Yeshiva blogged, "Here's Nancy from London, England, virtually visiting her great-great-granny Sarah at Yeshiva." In 1852, Solomon had a gallery at King Street, Charleston. He was at 230 King Street. This is 233. We can't positively identify the building, but this is an image of an adjacent building, probably much the same. In 1853, Solomon's father, now in Philadelphia, purchased for $600, considerable sum, quote, 3 Negro slaves, to wit Rose, age 37, Dinah, age 35, and Flora, age 70. Flora, not warranted sound. An aged mother and 2 daughters. This is curious. Was David buying their freedom? Was he now an abolitionist? Or were they just to look after him and Solomon's young family? All men are created equal, but not in Charleston, not in 1853. Solomon learned the daguerreotype process, which is an early form of photography. His reputation grew so that Colonel John Fremont asked him to be the official photographer on his 1853 expedition across the Rockies to map a railroad route to the new state of California. The expedition set off from Kansas City on horseback in September 1853. They suffered terribly in the freezing winter, taking 6 months to get to Utah. Solomon was too weak to continue and convalesced there in Salt Lake City, rescued by the Mormons who'd only been in Utah for a few years. And that 1,100-mile trek is now just a 20-hour drive. The musket that Solomon took on the expedition is owned now by Dick Marshowitz, who's the great-grandson of Solomon's daughter Charity. We saw it in Bar Harbor, Maine, a few years back. In 1856, Solomon published Incidents of Travel and Adventure with Colonel Fremont. It sold for a few cents. The book was a wild success, with Solomon described as artist hero of the Wild West. First editions now cost thousands of dollars. Steve Revo, who is a New York filmmaker, has directed Carvalho's Journey, an award-winning documentary about Solomon. It premiered at the Lincoln Center in 2016, and it's now out on DVD. Excuse me. Two exhibitions, By Dawn's Early Light at Princeton University and The First Jewish Americans in New York City, comprised exhibitions of early Jewish American art, featuring some of Solomon's paintings, largely assembled by our friend Dale Rosengarten from the College of Charleston, who wrote extensively on Carvalho in the book that accompanied the exhibitions. In 1865, Solomon painted Abraham Lincoln for his second inauguration. His son David always maintained that he went with his father to the White House for the sitting and sat on Lincoln's lap and played with his watch. As he would have been 17 at the time, this seems somewhat unlikely. In 1872, Solomon sailed to Martinique with his son David. But the trip caused Solomon eye problems. And in 1873, he underwent surgery for cataracts. Cataract surgery in 1873. Can you imagine the pain? His subsequent diminished eyesight forced him to stop painting, and there are no confirmed paintings by him after this time. He then reinvented himself as a professor, though academically he was quite unqualified. Professor Carvalho. Age 61, he patented his steam heating system and was awarded the American Institute's Medal of Excellence. Solomon's grandchildren adored him. Quote, "We all love to visit him. I remember my darling grandfather wearing black velvet smoking jacket, greeting us with a hug and a kiss. He entertained us royally. Grandmother, too, always seemed able to change the temper of her grandchildren into a pleasing one, as we all had, and still have, the hot, impatient tempers which we inherit from our Portuguese and Spanish forebears." That's written by his granddaughter, Claire Carvalho. Solomon and Sarah had another son, Solomon Solis, who later worked for Randolph Hearst as his business manager, and several consider him to be the role model for Bernstein in Orson Welles' Citizen Kane. The Carvalhos were quite a family. Solomon died in 1897, and he and his wife Sarah are buried in the 4th Sheriff Cemetery in Queens, New York, along with several other Carvalhos. David inherited his parents' good looks. He was a striking young man, described by his future wife Annie when she, playing the piano at a ball, first glimpsed him dancing as, quote, "an Adonis, so handsome." Within a few weeks they'd married, and 9 months later, Nancy's grandmother Adele arrived. Brought up in Europe, Annie, quote, "could play the piano, converse in other languages, embroider beautifully, but could not even cook a potato." David's handwriting career flourished. Author Conan Doyle remarked that Carvalho's powers exceeded those of Sherlock Holmes. Claire Carvalho, in her biography of her father, Crime in Ink, related how he had provided evidence for the notorious Dreyfus treason trial in Paris. The New York Times wrote, Carvalho, the handwriting expert, is to testify in the Dreyfus case. Carvalho's evidence is invited by those who insist the documents upon which Dreyfus was convicted are forgeries. And in another case, to weaken the prosecution's handwriting evidence, the defense lawyer hired his own expert, David Carvalho. This infuriated the prosecutor, who called Carvalho a notorious self-promoter and headline grabber who had just received international notoriety in the famous Dreyfus case. 4 years later, Adele met and fell in love with Captain Ernest French, a doctor with the British Army Medical Corps up from Jamaica, but according to his baptismal record, illegitimate and coloured. Not quite what widowed David Carvalho had in mind for his beloved eldest daughter, Adele. This is 19-year-old Adele, rather like Nancy was at that young age. Neither Adele's father nor her siblings attended their Anglican Manhattan wedding, perhaps because he disapproved of Ernest's humble origins and doubtful pedigree, or maybe just because she had married out. Her father, David, never spoke to his daughter again. A pity, because Ernest became an eminent Harley Street London physician, and it was clearly a happy marriage. So let's return again to the full 13 generations of Carvalhos. Adele did not bring up her children in the Jewish faith. After her husband Ernest died, she moved back to the US, and in 1954, a California gallery planning an exhibition of grandfather Solomon's paintings asked Adele for help, and she wrote back, "I'm not a Jewess. None of the family are of that faith. We've all married out of it and embraced that of our husbands or wives. We prefer not to be identified with it." Nevertheless, Adele was a keen tapestry maker, and the Star of David can be seen in some of her works. Since starting this research, we've met up with several living Carvalho descendants, an author in Maine, an insurance broker in New Jersey, a health professional in Baton Rouge, and an eye surgeon in Grand Rapids. They are all astonished at their colourful ancestors and their amazing journey. We tried to show in this brief time just one family's journey, migrating across many borders in search of better lives. When we commenced this research, the Carvalhos were just distant names in history. The whole process of discovery has resulted in us feeling we know each of them personally, their troubles, their travels, their tragedies, but also their successes, especially in America. Nancy and I had originally thought hers was just a simple story of ordinary folk. The truth amazed us. So we hope we've encouraged you to look into your own distant ancestors. You never know what you may find. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's quite incredible. I mean, it was such a vast piece of research. If anybody has questions, Tom will be very happy to answer them, to collect them, to ask Steve. Meanwhile, can I just let everybody know that next week we'll be having Stanley Mervis talking about reconstructing the Sephardic history of Jamaica. As many people know, many of the Jamaican records were lost, and Stan, through looking at the probate records, has managed to reconstruct a lot. Can I also give a shout out to the Jewish Genealogical Society of Great Britain? Of course, this talk was given to them 2 years ago. And if you don't belong to this society, it has a flourishing Dutch and Sephardic group. The next meeting is on the 18th of October. Please God, it will be live, but who knows? And the subject is the House of Rothschild in Italy and the Jewish community of Naples, and that's by Marco Soria. I should also add that the Jewish Genealogical Society of Great Britain has what is unquestionably the best Jewish genealogical library in Europe. So, Ton, do you want to?
Yes. Can I first ask Keith to put his camera back on?
Oh,
Video stopped.
On the whole time.
oh dear, you should have told me.
No, it's
I don't
okay.
know what. I'll start video. Right.
Yes, start video. That's it. Thank you. I'll start at the bottom. Someone asked about David Nunes Carvalho. Was he married to Sarah de Azevedo, daughter of the rabbi from Bevis Marks? Or was the different branch of the Cohen de Azevedo family?
I can't hear what you're saying, actually, Tom. You're asking, is this a question for me?
Yes, that's a question for you.
Okay.
David Nunes Carvalho married Sarah de Azevedo. Was she related to the rabbis of
Yes.
Marks?
Yes.
And how?
I think I think 2 or 3 of the marriages were by the Carvalho men were visiting rabbis from Bevis Marks, wherever, and who tended to bring their daughters with them. So yes.
Your camera off the whole time. I tried.
Another question about David Nunes Carvalho. He had another daughter. Did she marry Jewish, and are there descendants from them?
Claire.
Which
Claire.
Carvalho are we talking about?
Claire.
It doesn't say in the question.
I would imagine you're talking about my grand aunt Claire,
yeah.
David Nunes Carvalho's second daughter.
Yeah.
What was her husband?
I think so. Yes.
Yes, Adele was one of 5. She had Claire.
Yeah, but the daughter, did she marry Jewish?
Yes,
yes, she did.
Thank you.
He was an author.
A question to me privately: did they trace the descendants, or what happened to the various enslaved owned by several generations? Did you happen to do research into the slaves of the family?
No, we didn't. We did not follow the slaves.
Mm-hmm.
Next time.
Yeah, I can imagine you had a lot to do without that already. There are a lot of thank yous for an amazing presentation and fascinating family history.
I'm sorry Keith had his camera off.
Probably just distracting.
No problem.
Very distracting.
Yeah.
You saw the slides at last.
Yeah. And someone thinks that she might be related to Isaac Lissa.
Yes.
That's Deborah Lissa. I would suggest that she could get into contact with you privately. And there was a question, there was a remark about the Solis family. Peter Rabinovich has done extensive research into the Solis family.
Yes.
Has
Big
a lot
family.
of information about them.
Yeah.
And he is happy to chat and to share the photos that he has. And then that's about it. I'll go to the bottom to see if there are any new questions. And there's another remark by Stella Benson. She is also descended from Nunes Carvalho from Samuel. And her brother was Robert Nunes Carvalho. I thought they are in your book as well. And what effect did the American Civil War have on the family? The Civil War.
That's an interesting question.
1861,
Yes,
1865.
we haven't researched that. They were clearly in somewhere like Philadelphia or Baltimore during that period. So they were in the north, but obviously they had a lot of connections down in the south. No, I don't know.
Good question.
Yeah. Next, for your next research.
Yeah.
Is Carvalho a Jewish name? Is it solidly Jewish, or?
I think that variants of the name Carvalho is quite a common name in Portugal. It's spelt in different ways.
Pronounced in different ways.
Pronounced in different ways as well. If you look at a phone book for Portugal at the moment, you'll see dozens and dozens of them. So I don't think it's specifically a Jewish name, but all the Nunes Carvalhos we've come across have been Jewish.
Yeah.
Nunes.
And
we've actually got Solomon on the wall behind Nancy, if you can.
Yeah. Yeah. Great picture.
Yeah.
Handsome fellow.
Yes. My father looked very much like him.
Yeah. And that's the end of the questions so far. David is
David is screwing up as ever.
Yeah.
So can I just tell everyone that today is Tom's birthday, and we wish him a very happy birthday.
Yeah.
I would play the Dutch national anthem, but I'm the Facebook group on my mobile phone at the moment.
We'll open a bottle of port for you, Tom.
Yes, thank you.
And we're really grateful to Keith and Nancy, because it's an absolutely fascinating piece of work. It's something I'm personally trying to do, is just to trace my family from there to now, and just to see and understand how everything has changed and evolved. And I think the Sephardim are a fascinating case study, because our ancestors were so mobile. So as we said earlier, that next week we welcome Stan Mervis. We've done some very significant research onto Jamaica. If you wish to support Tom and myself and this project, that would be very kind, and you can sign up at Patreon. This is a monthly payment. A number of people have asked about one-off payments, and we'll try to work something out. The advantage of this is that we have to take out subscriptions with Zoom and various other websites, and this just means that we know where we are. Just to plug ourselves, you've already heard about the excellence of Tom's genealogical research, and we can both help you should you be researching your family history, just to find out who they were, or if you maybe are applying for Portuguese nationality. If you don't recognize the picture, is Spinoza.
Coming up all the time.
Tom, is there anything else to?
No, a lot of happy birthday wishes. Thank you, everyone. And big thank you to Keith and Nancy for this talk. It's a very interesting family, and it's been a privilege to watch it unfold throughout the years. Great stuff. So I think you can unmute everyone, and we can say goodbye.
Okay, thank you. Well, before I do that, we're just really grateful for everyone to be here, and especially Rabbi Berger. It's nice to see a rabbi from our community here as well.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone is now unmuted. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great.
Bye.
Thank you.
Happy
Bye,
birthday,
thank you.
Tom.
It was great.
Yes,
Happy
thank
birthday,
you.
Tom.
Very
Thank you.
good.
Sing.
Happy birthday. Thank you very much.
Happy birthday.
Thank you, Keith
Oh,
and
no.
Nancy.
Thanks, Keith and Nancy.
That was terrific.
Philadelphia.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wait, Keith and Nancy, can you leave your email?
Yeah.
Yes.
How do you do that?
Sorry.
Can you leave your email? How do you
I
do
think
Write
it?
it in the
why-
chat.
Put it in
Can
the
I
chat.
can I suggest you email Tom or David?
yes,
And they
Yeah.
can pass anything on. They can pass stuff on to me. Otherwise, it'll get
Yes.
mixed up in the.
we'll be happy to do that.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I hope it's not too hot where you are in London. It's absolutely sweltering. And we look forward to seeing everyone next week. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.